Hey guys, um, I was very interested in this week's topic of ataxic dysarthria. It's not something I was very familiar with, but specifically the video talked about Freidrich's ataxia, which is something I was not familiar with at all. I'd never even heard of it. So I was really interested in seeing the videos, and the families it talked about were really interesting to me. As far as the Bodies go, I thought it was really interesting that the two girls were sisters, but they weren't diagnosed at the same time. They presented really differently. Um, but they still had the same disease. As far as Samantha, she was the older sister. She talked about having speech difficulties, hearing difficulties, and a slight spine curvature. But the younger sister, Alexandria, had definitely much more difficulty with the curvature of her spine, and talked about her having two rods placed that go all the way from her shoulders down to her pelvic bone. And then they also talked about her rapid heartbeat. So that was just really interesting to me that they can have the same disease, be really close in age, and they still present totally different from each other. As far as Benj and Alex, the twin boys, go, um, I was really kind of taken aback that and impressed really that the mom, even like losing her son, she saw pretty quickly the importance of her donating his organs for research. That obviously turned out great. She said there's been 2 research papers written thanks to them, and they found the gene for Friedrich's ataxia, so that's awesome. But I do wonder if she didn't have the second son with the disease as well, would she have been as motivated to be involved in the research and things like that? But nonetheless, I'm really glad she was, and I think that's great that even though going through a traumatic event like that and losing your son, she still saw the importance in it. And then Donovan was the little guy at the end. I think he was about 10. And the thing that stood to me about them was how emotional the mom was. She had the youngest child that was in the video. But she was definitely the most emotional, even though they talked about that his progression was the most mild and that he was still able to walk through the house. He didn't have heart enlargement. He liked to swim, like he could do all of that, but still it just shows that even though it may not be the worst case scenario, it's still really hard on the families, and that stood out to me. As far as various factors that impact the family dynamic, I saw and heard all of them talk about just they're all being very positive, and I know it's something that they didn't all just hear the day that they were videotaped, but they've all realized that you never know what it is that you can do until you're put in a situation like that, and I think that's really important for these families to understand is that you will get through it. It's the hands that you were dealt, and you deal with it the best you can. And I think that helps a lot of families just remain happy and do the best you can. I also thought the family dynamic of the twin boys and the sisters, I thought it was nice. Like, it's crazy that they both have the same disease, but that they would have each other to talk to and go through it together. But I even saw with Donovan, the little guy, he didn't have any siblings that had the disease, but they still interacted with other families, the other 2 families in the video that had the disease. So he still had that support there, and I think that does impact your own family dynamic. Just if you see everyone trying to be supportive and happy and everything that you can, it really brings you closer together. As far as clinical aspects, the things that stood out to me the most, especially after reading through the book and kind of seeing the video and seeing everything, was the Arctic and respiration, especially with Alexandria. They showed her specifically at the SLP, and the SLP had talked to her about, had her read a sentence and talked to her about how she didn't make it through the sentence without taking a breath, and that she took that breath early on, but then by the end of the sentence she was running out of air, and so she talked to her about go ahead and taking that breath. And so I think some of the things that might help her would be things like slow and controlled exhalation and speaking immediately upon exhalation would be 2 therapy techniques that I think that SLP probably would have tried to work on with Alexandria, and I think in the long run that respiration would help her prosody as well. It showed her making her voice go up and down. She thought she would be unable to do that, but I know they all kind of relate, but Arctic and respiration were the two main ones that I noticed. And as far as assessment and treatment of people with ataxia, in the book it talked about important evaluation tasks being things like alternate motion rates, and then reading, conversational speech, and repeating sentences that contain numerous multisyllabic words, because the breakdown usually occurs in those multisyllabic words. So it didn't differentiate with those things as if they're important for kids or important for adults. So they're kind of important with everybody dealing with ataxia, all over the board. I do think in terms of children, it was especially Friedrich's, it was a gene. And so it's very traumatic for the parent more so than the child. All the kids that talked about it, both Samantha and Alexandria, talked about how they didn't understand when they were diagnosed. They didn't think of it being a big deal because Samantha said, when they told her she would probably pass away by 17, she was only 8, so 17 seems like a really old person when you're 8. But when you're 14, 15, you realize that that's not old at all. So I think it can be much more traumatic for the parent, and that's where the counseling might come in. And so the counseling might be more beneficial for, immediately for the parents instead of the kids, and then maybe more important for the kids as they begin to understand what exactly this disease is. Whereas with adults, the ataxia is usually caused by traumatic brain injury or stroke, or the book talked about toxic conditions. So the ataxia is something that's secondary, so maybe it's not the predominant occurrence. So it just doesn't affect the same way that it would affect the parents and things like that of a young child. I also wrote down that some of the devices that adaptive devices that might be used are, wheelchairs that would go across the board for adults and children, but things like the use of an AAC device could be used for both, but that it would affect kids differently because they would be using it in school, or things like the wheelchair that the child that Donovan was using at baseball practice is just different than what an adult would have to use. So those are just some of the things I noticed, and I hope everybody has a great week.